Now, today we'll be exploring the topic Unlocking Gen Z's Potential by Nurturing Engagement and Aligning Values. Gen Z has proved the most disengaged generation in the workforce, yet employers can make a difference and boost their business by listening to what Gen Z is saying about what's important to them: career growth, personal well-being, and community at work. We'll explore how to pursue these goals by empowering managers, creating clear job descriptions and performance management, promoting inclusivity and belonging, and offering flexible work models. Today's webinar is presented with support from HiBob, and I'll tell you a little bit about them. Bob is a modern HR platform that enables mid-sized businesses to create remarkable work experiences. As the world of work continues to evolve, Bob adapts to business needs using unparalleled configurability that can handle everything from remote and hybrid work to global expansions and non-traditional organizational structures. Now, before we get started, here's a few logistical items. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand soon after the event, so you can look out for an email in about 24 hours with the link. The same email will have info on how you can get professional development credits for this session from both the Society of Human Resource Management, or SHRM, and the HR Certification Institute, HRCI. And look out for a written account of this conversation on our website, fromdayone.co. Around 45 minutes into this webinar, we'll have a Q&A session with our guests from HiBob. You can submit your questions at any time during our conversation using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And remember, this webinar is designed to be of service to you, so please send us a question and we will aim to respond. With all that said, let's meet today's speaker. I'll be discussing this important topic with Rachel Schoenwald, Senior Product Marketing Manager at HiBob. Rachel, hello.
Hi, good to be here.
Thank you. While we get started, I'd like to put up a poll. I'd like for our audience to take a look at this poll while we get started. Just a courtesy to our sponsor, wants to hear a little bit from you. Rachel, tell us about what you do at HiBob and how you came to your job.
Sure, I just celebrated 3 years at HiBob. We are a multinational mid-sized company, and I think one of the most fun parts about being in this space is that we call it, we drink our own Merlot. We use our own platform and we use our own research, and everything that we do, we use internally. I have spent the past 3 years just diving into the world of global HR, and understanding the different nuance of compliance between the United States and Europe and Australia, what it means to have an EOR and to have employees all over the globe, what everything that's happened, since the pandemic especially, has done to the modern world of work, and what are the challenges and pains that HR leaders face day to day, whether it be the big issues of DEI and B and culture and engagement, or the small issues of, how do I optimize my onboarding and make sure that everything that I do works for every single employee in the company? And how does HR become strategic and influential within the C-suite, and within the business? I think the thing that I've learned the most over the 3 years is the people in your company is the largest line item within your financial reporting. And therefore, it should have an equal amount of thought and resources and process. And HR has known this, and they've always known this. And it's my mission to make sure that HR has the data that they need to tell that story, that they're able to be empowered, and that they're able to be influential within their organization, and that you can't have a business without the people. And that's really what matters. And that's how we all work towards that goal of growing our businesses.
All right, well, let's get started. So we're going to talk about young people today, Gen Z. So with the recent addition of Gen Z to the workforce, they're still pretty new in the working world. What does that do to the makeup of the overall workforce? Where do they fit in? What are their most notable idiosyncrasies that we've seen so far?
Definitely. So we've done some research. We've actually been doing it for a few years now on Gen Z. And I just want to share some of those findings with everybody. Let's make sure I know how to use technology. There we go. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
So we're in an unprecedented time because we have four generations in the workforce. We have the boomers that are starting to retire, and we have Gen Z that is entering, and they're going to make up 30% of the workforce by 2030. Now, it's just the beginning of 2024. We've got 6 years. So now's the time where we can start to recognize, influence, and inform other people, and to make the progress and kind of make the changes that we need in order to accommodate Gen Z entering the workforce. What they're looking for is a little bit different. I don't think it's radically different than what we've seen in previous generations. And, you know, if you spend time on TikTok or Instagram Reels and you kind of follow people that are talking about these generational gaps, we kind of see that it's a natural progression from millennials to Gen Z. And Gen Z is, you know, prioritizing themselves, and they're setting boundaries, and they're saying, you know, I work because I need to and I need to live, but it's not the end all be all. And so their expectations of a workplace are different. Now, I'm saying all this in broad brushstrokes. You know, we need to be able to think about an entire group, but we also don't want to pigeonhole or stereotype them. They're not a monolith. And so we try to make the best decisions that we can based on the data and based on the responses that we're getting. So I always ask when we're talking about these kinds of subjects, you know, let's think about how we can hear from this group and try to make their experience and engage them in the best way possible without necessarily pigeonholing them or, you know, discrediting what they're asking for.
Let's talk about, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, so I was just going to say, the one thing that we found in this research is that most of them don't expect to be at their current workplace 2 years from now. You know, we know that with millennials, like the whole work at one place forever thing, and with Gen X, isn't really a reality. And that cycle is shortening more and more and more. So Gen Z is saying, there's no way I'm going to be here in 2 years. Like, I'm going to be gone. And if they're really unhappy, they're going to quit without having their next job lined up. And that's something that was kind of unheard of for previous generations. And so it's, you know, while like I said, it's not a totally different approach, they're kind of taking it to a further extreme than we've ever seen before.
You mentioned not wanting to discredit Gen Z, and I think that happens a lot to young people. When I entered the workforce as a millennial, everybody loved to hate on millennials, and I think it just happens with all young generations. So I want to talk about significant misunderstandings about Gen Z and their place in the workforce. What have you seen?
Yeah, so I think that there's a few things. It's, you know, we've got some more stats on that as well. I'll go ahead and show you. When we're talking about what do they want, they're looking for that two-way trust and for that investment in themselves. And I think we saw this with millennials a lot as well. They're looking for companies that, you know, aren't going to use them and abuse them, but are rather going to give them what they feel that their worth is. And if that means, you know, respecting their boundaries of the hours that they're working or giving them professional development opportunities, you know, those are both ways that they're asking for things that are different, and they're kind of demanding them. And then it comes back to that if they don't get what they want, they're just going to quit. They don't have this long-term career path in mind. They're still at their beginning, and they're still experimenting and try to find out.
What about establishing a sense of trust with their youngest workers? You talked about some of the things that Gen Z expects. I know another trend among young people, and frankly, among a lot of people working today, is wanting to work for a company whose values match their own, wanting to work for a company that contributes to a greater good, that has a positive influence on the world. So, how can employers establish trust with young workers whose standards are pretty high?
Yeah, that's absolutely something that we saw in the research. In fact, that was one of the top reasons that a Gen Z employee either wanted to work at a company, or like their consideration for taking a job, or why they wanted to stay at their company. And I think that at some point in our careers, especially when we're young and idealistic, we all kind of have that thought. But the reality is, not every corporation is a nonprofit, and they can't be. That's not the way the world works. We understand that, and Gen Z needs to understand that as well. However, I do think that there are a lot of different opportunities for organizations to align with those values or show their shared values, be it the work that they do and the product or the output that your company brings, or as the HR team internally. So we saw in one case, if you're looking at the internal work and the culture of the HR, we saw a much higher proportion of Gen Z that was satisfied with their workplace when they had DEI and B and belonging and inclusiveness. And, specifically, they pointed out LGBTQIA programming. When that was present, their satisfaction went up versus not having those, satisfaction was much lower. So it can be through the culture of your company and the resources that you provide, having an ERG, just having that consciousness of DEIB and having those policies, and then making sure that you're publishing them internally and externally. You want to make sure that everybody within the organization knows that you have those, but you also want to attract and recruit that young talent by putting that first and showcasing that. On the flip side, if you want to talk about, what the good your company is doing, I've heard from some of the HR professionals in our network about how they've done essentially programs where they've gone to their customer teams and their customer success teams, kind of done some interviewing about what are the positive ways our product or our whatever we're selling is having a positive impact on the world. It's not, it might not be everything. It might not be every customer that you're doing. When I think about HiBob, I like to look at the way that we're able to empower HR teams to be people-centric and to put culture first and to, have an employee-centric, value system within their company. To me, that's doing good in the world. That's the best that I can ask for from a for-profit company. And so doing that exercise, finding those values, finding those pieces of good, and then sharing that internally within the company is another great way to kind of, give that positive spin. And it's not spin in the PR sense. It's, genuinely doing the exercise and being able to identify those values.
I know from my own reporting and then talking to folks like you, Rachel, that, even though Gen Z, not in all cases, but in many cases, they might be a decade or more away from adding a child to their family. But when they go work for a company and maybe in the interview stage, they learn, oh, they have excellent parental leave, or they have, reproductive rights, reproductive health care, they have fertility care, they have all these options. Even if there are menopause, that was another one. Young people seeing menopause benefits and going, I like the tone of this, even if I'm nowhere near ready to use these benefits or these policies. It tells them something about the way the company considers its employees. And so, yeah, not necessarily spend, just communicating, this is the way we do things. These are the things that we value. And I know a lot of people, even if they're not ready to use them, it makes a difference. It matters to people.
It totally does. And I think that, we talk about this, we've done a lot of work on pay transparency and a lot of research on that as well. And within the HR community, we're so used to these things, like we take it for granted. And we know how we got to this value story. And as somebody who bridges the gap between HR and marketing, I think everyone in every business always needs to be doing marketing for themselves. And this is the time where HR can engage their marketing team and, take those marketing principles to tell this story. If you have those policies, how did you get there? Why did you decide to do that? Who led the charge? Who contributed to it? Who is the process for that? Having the transparency and telling the story about why you made this decision can have such a big impact. And I think especially for Gen Z, it's really important because what they're missing is the corporate experience. I mean, just age-wise, like you physically can't have worked in the corporate world for that long. And so lifting the veil on those and showing them how decisions are made, how business decisions are made, and why you made those business decisions are not only going to help them in their career, but they're going to help them understand, where you're coming from and why you decided to do this, and why, even if they're not interested in having children at all, having a good parental leave policy or having a generous parental leave policy is actually meaningful, and impacts your culture. I was with our chief people officer, on a work trip, and we happened to go to the airport at the same time. And she told me the entire story about how we decided to get to this parental leave policy that we were implementing globally. That was one that it's the best one of any company that I've worked for, and goes above and beyond standards required in all the different countries that we work in. And just hearing that story was so exciting and empowering, even though I am not going to use it or benefit from it. I appreciated that everyone else is able to.
We've gotten a lot of good chatter in the Q&A function, so I want to encourage people, keep submitting your questions. We'll get to as many as we can toward the end. Some folks are leaving comments, which I appreciate too. I'll read some of those. One of them I'll just mention really quickly. Grace commented that even though Gen Z isn't necessarily maybe using parental leave yet, many of them are caretakers to other family members, maybe siblings or parents, or maybe you have a family member who just needs more care, and yeah, that happens at any age of one's working life. Let's talk about career aspirations for Gen Z, Rachel. I know young workers, based on your research, they want a clear path to career advancement. But how can employers lay out professional growth paths in a way that makes sense to people who may not know what they want yet in 5 years? And I don't think that is unique to Gen Z. I think that's the way a lot of people in their early career, they don't necessarily know where they want to be in 5 years or how to get there. So how can employers help?
Yeah, this is something that we've been exploring a lot and asking for a lot of input within our professional HR networks about how they're approaching it as well. And I have heard the gamut, somebody who was at Meta, not necessarily for Gen Z, but within software development, the software developers who weren't going to be managers, they're just going to continue to be ICs, still wanted pay bumps and reviews and promotions every 6 months. And they built out like a 30-level software developer career path, which is probably not realistic for most of us. Maybe not the best approach, but you've got to, when you're dealing with that kind of scale and you also have that kind of resources, it might be a different calculation. I think it's about, first of all, having that structure in place so you know what you're offering and what that career path looks like. And bringing in the managers and the leadership for those teams that have a large number of Gen Z workers. When I think of my own organization, a lot of times it's that BDR function or customer support function where you have a lot of entry level coming in. Then it's about setting up the path and what are those benchmarks and what are those goals. Now, if you ask somebody early in their career, they're going to want a promotion every 6 months. I mean, who doesn't want a promotion and a raise every 6 months? But that's probably not the best use of all of our times. Rather, having those career paths with the goals, with the performance reviews, with the feedback in place so they can understand the path and understand, I'm going to have a performance review every 6 months, every year, whatever, your company cadences. And during those times, I'm going to have check-ins about these specific skills, about, my performance on these things, on the goals and whether I've met them. And then looking forward to what the next steps and the options are. Just say, even if you say you need to be in this role for 2 years before you're considered for a promotion to senior, or before you're able to apply for a new job internally within the company. Having that transparency is going to go a long way, because it is a business. And so you need to do what's best for the business, but you don't want to disengage people in the meantime. And when you have something that you're working towards, I think that usually you see a lot more productivity and you're going to see better results because there's a path. Now, the flip side of that is, if you're setting these benchmarks, you have to be able to actually fulfill them. So if you say, after 2 years, you can apply for an internal job, everybody applies for an internal job and no one gets it, you're going to have a problem. But finding things that are realistic, being transparent, and then the hardest part for all of us, training the managers to be able to do that. This isn't only HR's responsibility. These are managers' responsibility as well. And it's not easy. We all know that, but engaging them in the process, getting buy-in from their executive is always going to be those things that are going to help you along the way.
We had someone ask in the Q&A, how is demanding professional growth different from what previous generations have demanded? I don't think you're suggesting that other generations have not. The working world, the workplace is entirely different than it was 15 years ago when the last generation entered. So anything else you would want to add to that?
I think, and again, at this, what I'm about to say is a little bit in broad brushstrokes, so we don't want to make assumptions about everyone, but Gen Z is living at home at a higher rate than any other generation before. I moved out when I was 18. I never moved back in with my parents. But when you don't have rent to pay, when your financial responsibilities are lower, and not getting into the debate about what it should be or where they should be or if they should be living at home, that's just the reality of the situation. When your risk isn't as high, you're willing to quit, and so the consequences are higher turnover rates.
Well, if the turnover rates are higher, and they're more likely to leave for what in their consideration is a better opportunity. How do you talk about career potential and career growth when tenure is so much shorter? What case can an employer make to get them to stay and grow?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think it's about, once you have that path, that's going to make it a little bit easier for them to actually envision themselves. So if they're in a role that they don't love, but they know that they're going to be able to try something else, you're going to stay invested in it. And it just psychology wise, that's true. If you get through 80% of a online quiz, for example, the likelihood that you're going to complete it is much higher than if you only get 20% through. So the more that they've invested, the more likely they're going to stay. How do you get them to invest? By giving them the opportunities and creating the formal paths for them to do that.
What about demonstrating opportunities as early as the recruiting stage? Employer branding is a really big part of what talent acquisition does now. They have a recruiter and someone who works in TA has to have so many more skills. I mean, it's already a highly skilled job. They're responsible for a lot more now than they were when the last generation entered the workforce. How do you brand a company as one who enables growth early in one's career?
Definitely. We practice and we speak frequently about engaging marketing in that company branding. It shouldn't only rest on talent acquisition shoulders to do this. You bring in the professionals at that, at the branding and the positioning and the marketing, and ask them, to help you create those things. But absolutely, be it on your career page, if you're in person at career events, there's a whole host of different technologies even now that are just, little widgets that you can overlay, but being very clear about what your company values are, and then also knowing your audience. So even if you don't have, career pathing opportunities or mentorship or that kind of thing generally on your career website, making sure that you have a section in it for every job where you're recruiting entry-level workers. So you see it on LinkedIn, on Indeed, on all the pages. And so if they're not on your website, they're always going to understand why this is a good place for them to work and what's going to attract them.
I mean, so many more companies now are investing in early career programs. I mean, in part because there are some job functions where the boomer generation is aging out and they need young people to fill those roles. And so not only are they branding their company, in some cases, they're branding a discipline or a field or even an industry to get young people interested in doing that. There's a whole new marketing aspect to talent acquisition now, I think.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Oh, we had an interesting question about sourcing young workers for job functions like accounting. I think that's a really great example. It's funny, when I was in when I was in business school, I actually was given a case study project exactly for that from a local accounting firm on how to recruit the state students to not move up to Chicago. We were in Indiana at the time. Um, and I think that those are the biggest opportunities of people don't know. I didn't know what product marketing was in my first job. I mean, I didn't work in a company that had product marketing. And so having those formal opportunities in education as an option for your entry-level workforce and for Gen Z can make a huge impact on finding people for those jobs. So while you might not want to build a direct career path from an entry-level BDR to accounting, if you're bringing in your finance leaders to speak to them about what they do and what they love about their job and what's interesting about it and what skills they have and they've developed, and then offer the opportunities to develop those skills, yeah, you're going to be able to create that internal mobility.
Let's talk about the new ways of thinking about mobility. Traditional thinking is career ladder. There've always been plenty of options. People switch careers. I intentionally sort of changed gears and went down a level several years ago because I needed a break. And I think that's far more acceptable now. People are doing that more. How does Gen Z think about career advancement? Is it vertical? Is it up and to the right? Is it straight up? How do they think about it?
What we've seen in our research is that they aren't even thinking that long term, and when you ask them about AI, they are like, AI is absolutely going to be a part of my job and it's going to help me in my job. Like they want to embrace it. They're technology forward. And if we think about everything that, I mean, we've all lived through, but they grew up in, over the past 5 years, I don't think that they have any long-term um, aspiration because we've had no stability. The thing that we know is changing is constant change. And that's very different from what people entering the workforce 20 years ago experienced. And so I do think that they see it, more as a lattice. And that, I think we say a lot also, it's not a straight path, it's a winding path, and there's different things that you want to do. Another thing that I like to talk about is neurodiversity also. When you're having belonging and engagement for your neurodiverse individuals, which again, Gen Z is being diagnosed at a much higher rate. I don't know whether they are actually at a higher rate than anyone else or not. But when you have those accommodations for people that, might need to try different things or kind of be in a different career path than what we typically see in order to get the most out of them and to optimize work, so they can be at their best and perform at their best. I think it's about kind of laying out the options and giving empowerment rather than setting a clear path of where you need to go. I also like to reference Radical Candor. If you haven't read the book, highly recommended. But the idea that people are always in different phases of their life and have different needs. So the same person can be, your superstar and somebody that is getting promoted again and again and again. But there might be an external force that causes them to need to kind of pause and pull back for a few years. If you want to retain them, if they're performing that well, you want to be able to accommodate that for the long term. And so whether that's changing their role or limiting their responsibilities temporarily, those are always good investments to make. If we start Gen Z out that way, then they're going to have they're going to stay longer and they're going to be able to have successful careers, regardless of what the path looks like.
I mentioned it a little bit before, but I hope you could go into more detail. Employees are increasingly interested in working for companies that reflect their personal values, but for companies trying to reflect the values of all your employees, it's futile. You can't possibly do that. In some cases, the company itself cannot stand for certain things just by virtue of what it does. Also, there will be employees in your workforce who are on opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of political issues, socioeconomic issues. There will just be an opposition. So a company can't fulfill that kind of need for every worker. How do you recommend employers respond to this desire from young workers?
So a few things. First of all, it is tough. it is rough out there right now, and we've got, elections coming up, and it's only going to get more rough just because, people are in different places, people have different beliefs, people have different backgrounds. How do you have belonging when, everyone doesn't necessarily believe or think the same thing? I think there's a few ways that we approach it. One is just being open and honest with when you make mistakes. We're not always going to get it right the first time. We're always well-intentioned. And, one of the biggest challenges in HR is when you don't get it right, people's feelings and personally are impacted in that. And so, reminding everyone, HR is a function, but you are all human beings. We're all human beings, and we need to have grace and empathy in anything that we do. I think that the next piece is educating Gen Z on belonging and inclusion doesn't necessarily mean the company is taking a stand on an issue. It means everyone, regardless of their stance on an issue, is welcome here. There's a slippery slope of hate speech and that kind of thing, but we want to create a safe place for everyone, even when somebody's safe place might contradict somebody else's. And so kind of thinking about it from that sense of how do we create that feeling of acceptance and the ability to listen in the workplace. But it's always going to be tricky when you're bringing up these hot topics in the workplace. And, we've dealt with that internally within our own company. I've seen it amongst friends and family members. It's tough to navigate.
More than 24 countries this year will be holding elections. And so there will be companies around the world, and some companies, that have a global presence will be dealing with these matters. Perhaps in other locations, the races will be different. And I know a lot of employers are maybe steeling themselves for this, getting ready and hopefully being thoughtful about how they'll help employees talk about these things or respectfully guide them into other discussions. I know.
And so one of the things that we do at Hi Bob is everybody is allocated a certain number of days of volunteer time. And we've got a really cool system in the platform where we track those things. So you always you can see I have this time available to me as an employee, and I can request it. My manager approves it. And so, even if you have that policy, expanding that if people want to do it for political reasons, again, it's not about bringing the politics into work. It's being able to take precious work time to do a few things that I'm passionate about. And so giving those opportunities, or, encouraging get out the vote. If you want to give a half day off on election day, if the country doesn't already have off for election day, to encourage people to show up to the polls, because it doesn't matter, the company's not telling you who to vote for. It's giving you the opportunity to actually go and participate.
So many companies, or more and more companies are doing that now really publicly. Patagonia is one famously that years ago closes their retail stores. Everyone employed by the company is given PTO to go and vote on election day. So they set an example in that years ago. I want to remind our audience that in about 10 minutes, maybe even sooner, because we got so many good questions, we'll take audience questions. So if you have any or comments for Rachel, put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can. Gen Z had the unique and kind of unfortunate experience of entering the workforce in the midst of the pandemic. Some of them even did quite a bit of their schooling. If they went to university in that time, they did it remotely. This is, of course, a period that changed the way we work. How has this affected Gen Z's relationship to their colleagues and their managers?
Yeah, so we see in our polling that one of the things that they want most is meaningful in-person interactions. Now, they specifically asked for that and not a return to office policy. They said that, and they also said, I want a hybrid work. So it's not about being in the office full time, but it's about having those, in-person opportunities to connect, because they feel the most disconnected. And we see that across the board. Sorry, I forgot the rest of your question.
How has it affected, entering a remote workforce or distributed hybrid workforce affected Gen Z's relationship to their colleagues and their managers?
Yeah, absolutely. So being able to build those relationships on Zoom is possible to some extent. It's probably not 100%. But even setting aside time just for kind of those team buildings or the chats or the coffees, now it's tough. Once you try to automate it, and bring in programs that automatically schedule things, or you just put recurring meeting on the calendar, it peters out, you lose it. And so it requires a little bit more thought and a little bit more nuance into how you're actually creating these experiences, because they're asking for it. They want it. Again, they're not a monolith. They're somebody who is an introvert that just wants to work at home and get their work done is always going to be like that, regardless of their age. But for many people in Gen Z, they do want these opportunities to connect, to find their work best friend, to learn from others. That was another thing that we saw during the pandemic. Entry-level workers and young workers were disproportionately affected because they didn't have those opportunities for informal mentorship and training that you get in the office.
Yeah, that was a really big part of I mean, it's important to work with folks at any point in your career, but that was really big for me early on in my career, is working with not only people that I liked and enjoyed, but people at different levels of a business and getting exposure to that. I worked at a startup where it was pretty easy to get a hold of the COO, and she was a woman. She was a role model. I really respected her. And because she was walking around the office, it really wasn't out of the ordinary to be able to ask her a question or just catch up. And in fact, years later, it was a company of 300 to 500 people, but years later, I actually just ran into her serendipitously, and she remembered me, and that, gosh, that made a huge difference. Yeah, and that was something that never would have happened if the company were entirely remote. I definitely would have missed out on that.
Yeah, making coffee next to the COO and like
Yeah.
sending them a Slack, huddle is not quite the same thing.
No, it's not. Yeah. I really appreciated that. I don't think it would be the same. And yeah, even if you have those formal, like, okay, we're gonna have like a skip level meeting, and we're gonna have one-on-one time scheduled together. There's a formality in that that's really kind of hard to break. Um, Being like, oh, how are you have to do the small talk, and it can get really awkward. So face to face, I see why they want that.
Totally. And another thing that we saw is that there was higher satisfaction levels within Gen Z that had formal mentorship programs at their company. And so, creating that so it's cross-functional, cross-level, that's another way to not only engage them, to give them the opportunities. If you're doing some kind of mentorship or internal programs and you're a remote company, or you're global or spread out, across the country, having those in-person opportunities around the work development, the career development, is also a great way to bring people to create that connection.
One attendee comments that their workforce is mostly remote, and they consistently get feedback that people want more and more in-person opportunities for departments, teams, even as the whole company. Grace says connections and synergizing in real life cannot be totally replaced by remote sessions, and I think a lot of us here would agree. In a
Absolutely.
handful, excuse me, in a handful of years, Gen Z will begin moving into their first leadership positions. Some may already be there depending on the structure of the company, but it will be not long until they do. What skills and characteristics do you think that this generation will contribute as leaders?
I think one of the things that we kind of see consistently is workers saying that they feel overworked or burnt out. Maybe that their boundaries aren't respected, but I don't think it really ever gets to that point. It's the personal fatigue that they have. And I think that we're going to see Gen Z managers really helping the rest of Gen Z learn how to manage that, how to set their boundaries, how to take care of themselves, how to, for better or for worse, push back on upper management if the expectations or the workload is too high, and they're not going to be able to perform at that level without burnout. And I think that's one of the big places that I think we're going to see. A lot of times when we see these things, you kind of see an overcorrection where it goes very far into the pushing back, and then you end up in the happy medium of where everyone can, you need to work hard sometimes, but you're not burnt out at a job after 9 months.
Yeah, I certainly hope a generation that um, has been has brought an awareness of well-being into the workplace that previous generations just haven't, but has benefited so many people. I certainly hope, yeah, they'll be leaders in equilibrium, I guess, and finding a way that everybody can achieve some kind of peace in their working life. All right, we're going to get to some questions from our audience here briefly. Before we do, I want to put up one more poll question. Hi, Bob wants to hear from our audience. So if you guys would put in your answer for them, that would be greatly appreciated. Like I said, we've got so many good audience questions. Let's just start chipping away because we've got some really good ones and some comments too. One of them is, Rachel, do you have advice on reward structures for young workers?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think in terms of reward structures, it really depends on the size of your company and the industry and the role. So, like I said, being transparent about what that reward structure is. So, creating a job catalog, creating pay bands, if you don't have them, is a huge undertaking. Like we know that it's scary. Other companies can charge you, it costs tens of thousands of dollars to build it. Starting with those roles that are specifically for your Gen Z and entry level workers and creating those the pay bands, the career pathing, the job levels, so you can give them transparency into that. I don't think that it's like a super common practice, especially in smaller and tech and private companies. Obviously, when you're in government, very clear structure, but introducing them to the structure, making it clear at where they can progress and what they can achieve. And then obviously you probably want to do it on an annual basis. For rewards, and then semi-annual basis for performance is the ideal. And that can also help play into the bigger organization of if you don't have a compensation and reward strategy and you don't have a cadence for it and you aren't communicating it, it's a great time to communicate that. Let people know so they don't come, employees don't wait until their performance review to ask their manager for a raise. They wait until they feel that they earned it, or something really made them mad, or they've gotten another job offer. And so if we run compensation cycles, at the top of the quarter or at the top of the half, H1 and H2 every year. So, if you're, first of all, that it's happening and when it happens. And second of all, what are the eligibility rules for it? You've only been here 3 months. You got promoted 3 months ago. You're not eligible for it. You need to be in this role 9 months before you can be considered. And then if you are considered, what are the criteria for getting it? It's not an easy task. And so doing any part of it or building the long-term plan of how you're going to get there can definitely make a difference.
One attendee asks, what operational and/or onboarding changes can companies do to lean into the short tenure of newer employees and spend their time and money wisely? I think it's a good question.
That's a great question. I love, planning for the ideal and being optimistic, but facing reality is always an important piece of it. I would say that making sure that you have an efficient onboarding plan. So what is the information that they absolutely need? And then kind of creating the success points for onboarding can make a big difference. So, push your managers in those roles to kind of break down what is the first thing that they can do on their own that's going to provide business value to the company and get them doing that. So don't spend 6 months learning the product or learning the function or learning all the places that you need to do things, breaking it down into smaller chunks so you can get them productive and shorten that time to productivity as much as possible.
We have another question here. How much value do you place from a hiring standpoint with resumes that show short employment history with Gen Z? I believe that's going to be everybody in Gen Z at this point. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's technically the oldest Gen Zs are turning 26 this year. So let's take for, the American university system, assuming that you're hiring university graduates, that's 4 years max. I think that if it's less than a year consistently, then you might want to ask questions about why. Often they'll take a job that they need to take and it might not be a good fit. Like the company might not be a good fit. I wouldn't exclude somebody because of that, but I would ask them about it and, see if they have a thoughtful response. See if they start crying because they're so traumatized by what's happened to them. You never know. The fun part of HR, we work with people, so you never know what's going to happen.
Gosh, one of my first jobs was a short-term contract position, and because that's what was available to me when I was 21 years old, that's what I could get. I had no work experience, and so that was the first entry on my resume, but it was a short-term entry because that's what was available to me after university. Um, an anonymous attendee asks, how has your research shown the best way to communicate with Gen Z, or do you know their preferences?
Oh, that's a good question. The best way to communicate with Gen Z, you're not going to like this answer, is in the way that's personally best for them, which means that you need to rely on your managers and communicate in many different ways. And that might be at an all hands, or, a department all hands, or a site all hands, or just within their sub-department all hands where you're joining their managers to tell these stories. That might be in emails. Within Bob, like within our own system, we have like a shout out. So we have like a social media homepage where everyone can write shout outs to each other, and we share all important company updates there. We also give other people kudos for helping us. And so it's finding multiple ways of delivering the same message. And then ideally running surveys afterwards to kind of figure out what's where did it catch the most? Where do we see the biggest impact?
Katie asks, or she says, this conversation is very on point with what I've been experiencing with my employees. Happy to help, Katie. They want a lot of support, initiatives, growth, culture. Then they ask suggestions to accomplish these things as a small company and a one-person HR team. Capacity is very challenging. I bet it would be.
Oh, totally. Totally. We have a lot of customers that are exactly in that position. It's so hard. So I would do, I would approach it from this way. First of all, I would run a survey, and, that might be an online survey, that might be interviews, with them to actually capture that data and figure out what is the most, if I can only do one thing, what is that thing going to be? Now, maybe that's having conversations with them. That's maybe making a list of things that you can do and letting them prioritize it. Another option would be to actually engage them and say, hey, I want to do this. I'm not going to be able to do it by myself. Obviously, you need to work with their manager to make sure that they can spend 5-10% of their time doing this with you, but empower them to, be the leaders on this. And then, once you make that decision, communicate why you made that decision, how it's going to work, and then what's going to be the next steps in the follow-up.
Relatedly, someone asks, are pulse surveys still the standard practice for gauging employee sentiment?
Um, we Yes. I mean, I think it's a great way. It's not the only way. I think it's the most efficient way. There are some challenges with it. You need to be sure that people are actually responding to them, that they're showing up in a way that is meaningful, that it's not too long, that you're asking the right questions. But pulse surveys are definitely a standard and a really important tool in gauging that feedback.
We have one audience member who comments that companies like Google are creating me manuals or book of me as part of onboarding, where folks can write up guides for their best communication styles, best meeting times. And they say this is a practice they think should be encouraged in intergenerational workplaces and everywhere. I've never heard of that. Very
That's
interesting.
actually something that we've recommended as part of this research. One of the things that our product does is everybody's got an employee profile, and it's completely configurable. And so we recommend not only do you need to have people's pronouns and their location and their working hours, but yeah, exactly. What are the best ways to work with me? Now, what I think is the fun challenging part about this is if you ask Gen Z just what's the best way to work with you, I don't think that they're going to have enough experience to be able to answer that. I'm close to 40 and I've just now figured that out. But asking those leading questions of, how do you learn information best? Do you prefer to be in meetings? Do you prefer an email? And kind of breaking that down for them so they can understand how to best work with them.
Yeah, sometimes, I mean, people of all ages are sometimes just like the self-awareness or even the practice. If you've been in one company where the culture, the standard, the way of doing things is this is everybody communicates in the same way, they may not yet be aware of what works best for them because they may have not have had the latitude to actually try it.
Absolutely.
All right. Someone asks, we're a fully remote company, so we won't be able to bring Gen Z into the office like they prefer. How do we keep them engaged and building networks remotely?
That's a good question. So there's a few different ways, depending on your budget, to approach it. Assuming you have very high budget, flying everybody in for on-sites, planning them very far ahead, giving them the time to be there is always a great opportunity and always a lot of fun. Lower budget, then, finding digital ways to bring people together. And so whether that's through ERGs or through, all the different career pathing options, mentorship groups, interest groups. I mean, just creating a book club, finding somebody that wants to create a workbook club and empowering them through company time, not to read the book, but to encourage people to come and join their book club, is a great way. One thing that we've done, we are hybrid and remote in the US. So we have an office in New York that's fully hybrid. You're in at least 2 days a week, but however long you want if you live in the New York area. And then about half of us are remote across the US. And so what we've started to do is we've started to create what we call villages throughout the country where we'll pair up everybody who's in the Bay Area and they have the opportunity to take a half day and get together. Now they're across all different functions and all different levels, and that actually really contributes to creating this village, meeting new people, having those connections that you wouldn't normally have. But it absolutely needs to have executive sponsorship, be it from HR or from whoever's the most senior person in that area.
An attendee wants to know about a HiBob capability. Do you offer a platform for internal mobility? For instance, something like a talent marketplace with projects that are available.
That is a great question. We don't at the moment, but we've got some really exciting things coming up this year that is all going to contribute to that. It's going to bring together basically open jobs and job recruiting, skills, and then learning management and kind of bring all that together. So stay tuned.
What is the best way to attract Gen Z? Is it social media?
That is a great question. I actually don't think that social media is necessarily the best place to attract them because if it's not authentic, they're going to scroll past it. So like if you've got a TikToker influencer, someone who is, who's doing this on their own anyway, creating that is going to be very difficult and very expensive. I think that we're still going to find those employees through the more traditional routes. But if they're not coming onto job boards and into job fairs, then yeah, it's going to get harder and harder to find that talent, which I think as much as we want to widen our pool, we also need to stand out from the crowd and differentiate for the people that are in market looking for a role.
Yeah, and what I see on employer, usually it's like an employer life at company, an employer brand, they'll do a TikTok feed or an Instagram feed. It tends to be on one of two poles. It's either, wow, they clearly have a young person in here, like killing this, like doing such a good job and kind of interested in working there myself, or it's like very corporate, it feels very flat. Manufactured is a way to describe that. And yeah, just I don't know, I would think that's almost worse.
It's very cringe, as they would say,
There.
which is cringe that I'm saying it on their behalf. Yeah. You can't win. I do think one thing that could be really interesting that I just thought of is headhunting for entry-level roles. Like if you don't have enough applicants, you don't typically do this. You're headhunting for higher roles. But if you have a recruiter and you just aren't getting the applicants, spending a little bit of time reaching out to people that look like they could be a good fit could probably go a long way. Because whereas somebody who is an executive, gets 5 messages a day, asking for their job, you're not getting that when you're entry level. And if somebody is personally reaching out to you, you're more likely to at least want to listen to that.
Yeah, and what a great compliment. I would have been so flattered that it happened to me.
Absolutely.
All right. Ernesto asks, any tips on how to improve the sense of belonging for Gen Z?
Yeah, it's a tough one, and I think that I I can't be prescriptive in what to do because it depends on who's in your company and the company culture. But I think listening and giving the opportunities to listen and to be heard in group settings, in individual settings, if your HRBP can dedicate the capacity to just having a 15 to 30-minute one-on-one with every person that's within their group. Obviously, you can't do that in a week or a month. It's going to take time. And when you send the invite, to be very clear, be very clear about what the initiative is and that everyone's going to get invites for it. Otherwise, they're going to be very worried about that they're getting fired. But just, inviting them to come and talk to you and to express, I think is a great first step. If you don't have any formal kind of belonging programs or you don't have a structure, you're just getting started.
You are crushing these rapid fire questions, Rachel. I appreciate that. From James, with middle managers experiencing the most stress in some research, I could definitely see that being the case. Middle managers are asked to do so much now. James asks, how will Gen Z handle that stress? I think this might have been a response to my question about what kind of managers will they be? To your point before, will they will they up and quit, or do you think they'll stay loyal? I mean, this is asking you to predict the future, but I like to know your opinion. And so would James.
I know I can't predict the future. I like to pretend that I can. But I think I wouldn't be working and I'd have a lot of money from the stock market if I actually could. I think that honestly, I hope, and this is like very personal to me, that they are leading the revolution, that we are going to see a change in the workforce, that what we see in unions and, just kind of this whole shift is just the beginning. It might not be. They might be in the same place that millennial managers are, burnt out, frustrated. It's not everyone, but it's a lot of people, and just kind of getting along. But maybe they are actually going to make a change. If we think back to what the workforce was like 30 years ago and today, if nothing else, technology has changed so much. Their openness to technology and willing to adapt is absolutely going to make a difference. What does that look like for us 10 years from now? I don't know.
I had a conversation earlier today with a professor of management at King's College London, who not only does she teach organizational behavior, she teaches it to Gen Z often. And this is a little bit of a tautology, but she's right, is that like change is changing faster. And the way the workforce is changing is happening in much more rapid succession. So, Rachel, you've been such a trooper answering all these questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to everybody's questions in the Q&A, but I really appreciate how people have been very chatty and engaged. That's wonderful. You've certainly piqued everybody's interest, Rachel. Well, thank you to Rachel, and thank you to HiBob, sharing all this very compelling research and your practical and positive advice. Thank you to HiBob again for their support, and to all of you for participating today. You'll receive your SHRM HRCI codes via email in 24 hours. Before you all sign off, I'm going to drop the link again to some complimentary VIP tickets for our virtual conference coming up next month on March 6th. That one is about tapping the secrets of energizing workers. So on behalf of all my colleagues at From Day One, thank you for participating. Stay well, and bye for now.